privacy policy and terms and conditions posted at textplan.us. Texting enrolls for recurring automated text marketing messages. Message and data rates may apply. Reply stop to opt out.
The pandemic has been hard on all our kids. New studies show more than 1 in 3 children who started school in the pandemic now need intensive reading help. That's right. Millions of kids in kindergarten through 3rd grade in the United States cannot read at grade level. Here's the good news. Your child can be reading in just 30 days, guaranteed, with Hooked on Phonics. Even if your child has been struggling, Hooked on Phonics will teach your child to read in just 30 days, guaranteed. And right now, you can get started for just $1. Text the word GRADE to 323232 right now. Hooked on Phonics is highly effective and incredibly fun, and everything can be done right from home and in less than 20 minutes a day. For more than 30 years, Hooked on Phonics has been the proven learn-to-read program that kids love to use. Text GRADE to 323232 and teach your child to read in just 30 days, guaranteed. Text GRADE to 323232 right now and get started for just $1. Text GRADE to 323232 now. Text GRADE to 323232.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back and looking at Aaron Burr once again. This is our second episode on Aaron Burr. Today we're going to be looking at the duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton that occurred in New Jersey in 1804. And Chris, I think this is a wonderful way to sort of close our look at Aaron Burr.
Yeah, you know, we've talked about the relationship, if you will, between Burr and Hamilton, and a lot of areas of intrigue, but also being disgruntled and angry. And, you know, usually during this time, whether it was before or after this duel, dueling was the most publicized method for settling questions. But really it was about settling questions of honor. Yeah. And it would take place between individuals from the same class or maybe from certain areas. Of course, this is a European thing that makes its way to America. And by the way, many people are familiar with the Burr and Hamilton duel, but Alexander Hamilton, he loved some dueling.
Yes. Yeah, he did. He actually, his son Philip was killed in a duel, as we're going to see, Chris, in the exact same spot he himself would be killed in, on the same location. And of course, dueling was, I think you mentioned this idea of affairs of honor and affair of honor. It was a really big deal back at that time. If you insulted a gentleman's integrity, if you insulted their honor, there was a process that people would go through in response to that. And at the end, if neither party was satisfied, there could be a duel. And of course, one person would choose the weapons. And in this particular case, both in Philip Hamilton's situation and Alexander Hamilton's situation, the weapon of choice was pistols. But Hamilton may have liked dueling, but it didn't work out well for his family.
No, and I think it's important, you know, we're going to talk about several duels that led up to Aaron Burr and Hamilton's duel, but maybe it's best just to kind of give an overview of what a duel actually looked like, kind of the makings, if you will, for the duel. I believe that, once again, the Broadway show Hamilton does a really, really good job of explaining the duel, talking about 10 steps to a duel, or the 10 commandments to a duel, if you will. But, you know, the one thing is the characters that are involved in the duel. You know, we think about that this is an affair of honor, if you will, between two people, but there were other individuals that were a part of this duel as well. And there's a lot of setup that goes into the actual meeting taking place. So long before the two people meet at the specified location, there's been a lot of work that's been leading up to this duel, if you will.
Yeah, there were other people involved. There had to be an exchange of letters. You know, when the offense, whatever that offense may be, some word spoken publicly, some word spoken in print, that was made public, whatever it may be, where a gentleman specifically thought his honor had been besmirched, there would be a series of actions that would take place, including but not limited to letters, trying to clarify, and as we're going to see with Hamilton and Burr, this certainly happened, trying to get an apology, trying to get a retraction or a denial, and of course, then other people would get involved, mediators would get involved, and then once the location was selected for the duel, the time and place selected, you would have your seconds. That is somebody there to sort of be the assistant, I guess you could say, of the parties involved in the duel. So it was a very ritualistic type thing. This wasn't just simply two guys going out in the woods and shooting at each other. This was a very ritualistic setup where people went through a prescribed process before they actually got to the dueling grounds.
Yeah, there's books. I think I forget the name of it, but Code Duella or something like that was the actual etiquette for how you complete a duel. So it's not just two people who are really just so angry and full of emotion that they just say, go get your gun out of your truck and let's handle this man to man. It's not that. It is prescribed. It's step by step. And, Alexander Hamilton, long before he has that duel with Aaron Burr in 1804, he is involved in 4 additional occasions of dueling long before that, whether it was serving as a second or even as a challenger. The first one he was involved on was in 1778 when there was an issue between a good friend of his, John Lawrence, along with Major General Charles Lee. And, that kind of dealt with the person that you're very familiar with, George Washington, that there had been some character assassination, if you will, on Washington. And so Lawrence was very upset about the way that Major General Lee had spoken of Washington. And so they were going to duel about that. And so Hamilton, he was Lee's second. He pretty much stopped that duel. So that was that first one that took place. You think
about, for our listeners who maybe don't know, Charles Lee was fired by George Washington on the battlefield over the way he led soldiers in battle. And the witnesses say that, and I don't know how reliable this is, but witnesses there say when Washington confronted Lee, he cursed, what was it, the phrase they used, he cursed until the leaves shook on the trees type thing. So Washington dismissed him then and there. And so the two men did not like each other.
Yeah, and then the second time, Hamilton actually gets upset with a clergyman. He gets mad at a clergyman because the clergyman has been going around making insulting remarks about Hamilton's political views. And as you know, Hamilton doesn't really have humility written upon him, and he's very, very prideful. And so he gets upset, and he offers a challenge to the preacher man and says, let's duel. And the preacher man says, no, thank you. I'm not interested in that. I think I'll pass. And he issues a third duel, which basically never happens. It settles without an encounter. And then, of course, the other one that many people might be familiar with, or maybe not, but actually involves an individual, Ray, whose name is James Monroe. And James Monroe, of course, President of the United States, but before he becomes President of the United States, there's this very big issue concerning Hamilton's relationship with Maria Reynolds, the Reynolds pamphlet, the Reynolds affair, which is explained a lot in the Broadway show. But Hamilton basically tells Monroe, hey, you got to stop talking about me with this Reynolds thing. It's got to stop. And Monroe refuses. And Hamilton says, I challenge you to a duel, if you will. And it was interesting that Monroe selects Aaron Burr to be his second in this proposed duel between Monroe and Hamilton. And they never met on the field. They stopped it before it happened. But it is interesting that you start to see this animosity between Burr and Hamilton creeping up into the duel with Lawrence and Lee. You see it now with the duel that didn't happen between Hamilton and Monroe, whereas Burr was actually siding with James Monroe.
Yeah, and you almost wonder when you think about that history that you outlined there so well, you almost wonder if Hamilton maybe had this idea, since he had never actually gone to the dueling ground, so to speak, maybe he thought the situation with Burr would be the same way. That it would be solved before it got to that point. And it sort of brings to mind a letter that Hamilton wrote to his wife in 1804, right before the duel. I think he wrote this letter about a week before the duel, and this letter, of course, was to be given to his wife Eliza if he did not survive the duel. And he says in there something that I think, in light of his history with dueling, is very interesting. He says, "If it had been possible for me to have avoided the interview, that is the duel, my love for you and my precious children would have been alone a decisive motive. But it was not possible without sacrifices which would have rendered me unworthy of your esteem." So he sort of, and I think this sort of goes back to, we talk about his ego, but I think it also goes back to the way gentlemen viewed themselves. That, he thought Aaron Burr had besmirched him. Burr thought he had besmirched him, and I think he sort of thought, well, there's just no way out of this, even though he had in the past, had peaceful resolutions. But once it got to the point where he knew he was going to the dueling ground, in his mind, there was no turning back. So, I don't know. Did he really oppose the idea of a duel, or was,
Yeah, and I think you have to ask, the question. I mean, it's very clear he had an addiction to dueling.
Yeah.
So the addiction,
like Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, but the addiction to dueling that he had never really made it to the field.
Right.
But the other side to that is, so it's kind of like, okay, yeah, I'm going to duel you, but I know that nothing's ever really going to come about with it. So we're going to duel, we're going to say we're going to duel, and then we're going to just say, okay, I'm sorry, and we move on to it. But that really changes in 1801, I believe. And that is when Alexander Hamilton's son, Philip Hamilton,
right,
is trying to honor his father. There is an individual who is a Captain George Eaker, who has been spouting off a lot of nasty things about Alexander Hamilton. And Philip, who becomes very unnerved by this and is very ticked off, having watched his father's example of dueling in previous occasions, says, I challenge you to a duel so that he can restore the reputation of his dad. So it's very noble, it's very honorable, this is very powerful stuff. But there's an issue that comes to dueling. Once you challenge somebody to a duel,
there's no backing down.
You got to go through with it, as you just said. You've got to do it. So two things have got to happen. You either have to say, I'm sorry for whatever it is that you did, or you've got to go to that field, draw your gun, and you have to shoot. And so here's Philip. It's still, and he's the eldest child, but he's still a child, if you will, who finds himself in a terrible situation. And that situation is he's trying to defend the honor of his father, but now he's challenged the guy to a duel, and the guy is like, okay, let's do this.
Yeah. And I think Philip writes his father basically asking, what do I do? And you would think, as a father, you would think Hamilton would say, well, just apologize or find a way out of this. But he doesn't. He actually basically tells his son, you got to go through with this. And it must have been advice that haunted Alexander Hamilton, for the next 2.5, 3 years of his life.
Yeah, Philip goes to Weehawken, New Jersey, and participates in the duel, and he'll actually die there at that duel. And honestly, the ideal outcome of a duel was to avoid it altogether, and it didn't happen. Alexander, in the song that deals with dueling in Hamilton, it says most disputes die and no one shoots.
Yeah,
that's Hamilton's view. But when his son dies, there's this hole that is left in his heart. But not only that, he also has this bitterness and this rage. We already know that he and Burr don't like each other. They don't. They are very, very upset at one another. And Ray, what I think is fascinating is we did a good job last week talking about the conflict between Burr and Hamilton. But it was really, really, really deep. And I found something interesting when I was going back to research this that I honestly didn't know before. And that was that Hamilton played a huge role in creating the Bank of New York and ultimately the Bank of the United States. You know, that was his whole thing. And for a while, Hamilton had the banking monopoly. Nobody had another bank. Nobody did anything. Well, what I found was interesting is that Aaron Burr has an interest in this company that was called the Manhattan Company. And the Manhattan Company supplied clean drinking water to the city of New York. And as part of their charter, they had the opportunity where they could complete money transactions. So in other words, Burr creates a bank through the Manhattan Company. So in a matter of moments, Hamilton's conglomeration of owning the banks is gone, because here's Aaron Burr who comes up, and he actually now is in competition with Hamilton. And it just so happens that the day before the Manhattan Company opens, Hamilton's brother-in-law, John B. Church, insults Burr in a deliberate insult. Just calls him out, says a bunch of things that are not true, says it in front of Burr's friends. Burr doesn't want to fight Church, but has to, his honor. And so he challenges Church to a duel, and they actually fought. And they fought with these pistols that were provided by Church, who is a relative of Hamilton, right? And so Burr and Church actually fight. They both miss. They say, this is stupid, let's end. But that's a big part that leads to the major duel that happens in 1804.
Yeah, and going back a little bit, you're talking about the tensions between Hamilton and Burr, and of course we'll get to sort of the big stuff that brought about the duel here in a minute. But going back to the election of 1800, which of course the major character sort of was, incumbent Federalist President John Adams, and then you had the main rival to John Adams, Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. Well, Jefferson and Aaron Burr, because of the way the Electoral College was set up at that time, tie in the Electoral College. They have a absolute tie, goes to the House of Representatives per the Constitution, and the Federalists, of course, now are out of the fight for the presidency. It's between two Democratic Republicans, Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, though he's not a member of the House of Representatives, his influence on the Federalists in the House was enough to swing the vote to Thomas Jefferson. But more importantly, he made some really bad comments about Aaron Burr there in 1800. Basically, the man's not trustworthy. I'd rather go with Thomas Jefferson than Aaron Burr. And to think about how Hamilton felt about Burr and how he felt about Jefferson, to say that he's willing to go with Jefferson for president instead of Burr, that tells you a lot about how Hamilton viewed Burr, and it was not good.
So I think that there's a couple things that once again lead up to this. So somehow, some way, we mentioned that aspect of it. We talk about this relationship about water, and also about Church and Burr going to this duel. There comes a point when Hamilton says something, and it just strikes Burr to the core.
Yeah, Burr is running for governor of New York. He's running for governor of New York, and Hamilton, he's a Federalist. The Federalists are now in 1804 out of power, and what power they do have is slipping, and Hamilton is not in a good mood about this. He never really got over the death of Philip. So he's just not in a good place in his life, and he's in a desperate situation. And Alexander Hamilton goes out and really says some bad things about Aaron Burr in letters, and Burr considered these things to be slanderous. He called Vice President Burr, because Burr at this point was Vice President, he called him a dangerous man and one who ought not to be trusted with the reins of government. And he called him a despicable person. Just terrible things he unleashed on Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr gets hold of this. He learns about this stuff, and he immediately writes Hamilton and basically says, look, do you deny this? If not, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, and ultimately what happens is we're going to duel, because that first step in a duel is to demand satisfaction.
Right.
And that's something that's been going on is they don't like each other. They want to win at all costs. And as I think back on Hamilton's life, and I know our focus is mostly on Burr, but if you think about Hamilton at this point, first of all, he absolutely detests Aaron Burr. No mistaken about it. As you mentioned, he helps Thomas Jefferson, who he doesn't like, but he helps him more just because he absolutely doesn't like.
I mean, you think about the conflict between Hamilton and Jefferson during the Washington administration and spilling over into the Adams administration. I mean, that was the not necessarily the single cause, but that was core part of that tension that developed during the Washington administration, where you see the rise of these two, I guess, political parties. And it really centers around Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Jefferson. Sorry.
And they both can't stand each other.
They don't like each other.
And so you add that, and it's just building and building and building. And then you have Philip, who tries to defend the honor of his father, and it ends up costing him. And Hamilton has guilt, he has regret, but he also has anger, because he's got to try to find a way to restore Philip somehow, some way. And the only way that he can do that is by getting rid of Aaron Burr. And so he will challenge to this duel, if you will. And, I think there was so many opportunities where Burr and Hamilton could have called it off. But neither one of them had the humility to say, you know what, I'm wrong. I admit it. I'm sorry. Let's just call this what it is, and let's be done. And they journeyed together and met in Weehawken, New Jersey, the same place where Philip had defended his father. They had a doctor that was on site.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about it, I don't believe the doctor was actually where the duel took place. My reading of some primary source material here indicates that the doctor was sort of, I guess, away, so he wouldn't. I think the doctor, the way I'm understanding it, was arranged by the seconds, so he wouldn't necessarily know who the person who dealt the fatal shot was. And he sort of comes up on the scene, and and after Hamilton falls, and we'll get back to that in a minute. But I think the doctor was sort of kept in the dark as to who the two participants were.
Yeah, for two reasons. The doctor always had to have his back turned, for the reason that you just mentioned. And the other thing was, dueling was illegal.
Yes.
I mean, this is not something that, it's even though it's an affair of honor, it is still illegal. And so if it ever went to trial, the doctor literally could say, I have no idea who it was that did it. I don't know who shot who. I know nothing. So that was a big thing. Here's the other cool thing about the duel. So if they did agree to a duel and they were going to meet, duels always happened early in the morning.
Yeah.
And, we might be thinking, well, why on earth would you do it in the morning? And it's very simple. If you waited till the evening, there was the tendency for people to get drunk, and they could get combative, and they would just, saying, sure, I'll duel you here, duel you there, and you could have all kinds of issues. But in the morning, first of all, nobody was out and about, so that protects you from people seeing what actually took place. You weren't drunk. You had a clear head, so you could still apologize and say, hey, this is not, what we really need to do. And the third thing is that it gave you clarity in the moment to see. You recognize what you're doing. Yeah. Turn away. So that was, that's interesting also with this. And then, Ray, we talk a little bit about the advice that one gives. I mean, what kind of advice do you give somebody when it comes to a duel? I mean, what do you tell someone? How do you keep your honor and not shoot your gun?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a very difficult question. And remember, when Philip wrote his father about this, Alexander Hamilton basically said, you got to go through with it. So I guess he viewed it very much the same way. So you mentioned early in the morning, 7 o'clock a.m., July 11, 1804. They meet in a wooded area in Weehawken, New Jersey, which, like you already said, dueling was illegal. It was illegal in New York, and it was illegal in New Jersey. So there had to be a sort of a secret rendezvous type of thing. The area that they met at was directly across from the Hudson River in New York. And like we've already said, this is where Alexander Hamilton's son Philip died, his exact same location. I'm sure there's some psychology there that somebody would, if they haven't already, probably needs to look into. And Hamilton and Burr, they get their pistols. They step 10 paces apart, and they turn, and on the command, Hamilton shoots, doesn't hit Burr. Instead, he shoots up and over Burr's head and hits a tree, and Burr fires and hits Hamilton.
It's an interesting footnote to that. You mentioned the letter between Philip and Alexander as far as Philip asking for advice. And you mentioned Alexander said, you got to go through with it. One of the other things that's in one of those letters addressing this whole duel, if you will, is that Alexander also advises his son. He says, when the time comes to fire, you fire your weapon in the air, which will put an end to the whole affair. And so he tells Philip to use a tactic which is called, I think, deloping.
Yes.
And deloping is illegal once again. It's strictly forbidden in that book of Code Duello because the whole reason that you're going there with guns is to shoot each other, right? And so you can't say, hey, just shoot it in the air and it'll end everything, because dueling's not a game. And when you issue it, or when you accept the challenge of it, you are declaring that you are willing to shoot and to be shot at, and so you cannot deliberately shoot over someone's head. Now, the problem is that history has always recorded that Alexander Hamilton did exactly that. He instructed Philip to shoot above, and he instructs himself to shoot above.
And, we don't know what Burr thought. Burr, he makes the point that, Hamilton had put on his glasses. Mm-hmm. He had aimed. So when it came time for Burr to shoot, and this is why you maybe wanted to be very cautious about wasting your shot, Burr shot him. And eyewitness report says that Hamilton, fell to the ground immediately, or almost immediately. And it's interesting that when this happens, Burr, his immediate reaction to Hamilton falling was to sort of run toward Hamilton, and then he sort of realizes what's happening and he leaves because the physician's getting ready to come up on the scene. And the physician was a guy called Dr. David Hasek, and he comes up on the scene and deals with the patient. But Burr's immediately going to get out of there. He's going to leave, and he's going to go back into the city where he's going to go on the run.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting that we, and I say we, but I think that the Broadway show Hamilton has kind of glorified Hamilton in this.
Right.
And it's painted Burr as guilty and as this murderer.
Yeah, and I don't know that Burr was a murderer here.
Right.
I mean, other than engaging in a duel and shooting someone, but I think Burr, I tend to give Burr a little bit of benefit of the doubt here, and I think he assumed Hamilton was going to shoot at him, so he shot at Hamilton, And
there's an interesting theory that is out there by some historians. I mentioned the story earlier about the fight between Burr and Church early on, Hamilton's relative. And when the duel was set between Burr and Hamilton actually got to choose the weapons that would be used.
Yes, he did.
And the weapons that he chose were Church's weapons.
Yeah.
And what some scholars have said, I don't know if you read this or not, but what it seems to be is that the pistols that Hamilton chose had concealed hair triggers that Burr didn't know about, but Hamilton did. And what a concealed hair trigger did is on those guns, it would allow you to not have to go all the way, but you could do, I guess, like a quick shot, right?
Right.
So you would be able to fire faster. So if that's true, and I'm not saying that's 100% out there, there's a lot of debate, and there's a lot of research that seem to think that that's there. But Ray, if that's possible, that was the type of gun that Hamilton knew, then you have to assume he went in with the intent to shoot him.
Yeah, and Burr, keep in mind also about Burr, is that if Burr had missed Hamilton, Hamilton had another shot. Mm-hmm. So Hamilton could have shot Burr.
Right.
So you're not excusing it, but just simply saying one can understand where Burr's coming from. Anyway, Burr flees. New York and New Jersey, of course, are interested in prosecuting him, but New Jersey actually does indict him. But he leaves. He goes to Philadelphia. He goes to Georgia. He goes to South Carolina. He comes back at one point to act. He is sitting vice president. Get this: the vice president of the United States is on the lam for murder. Murdering the former and first Secretary of Treasurer, a close confidant of the first president. So Burr is on the run, vice president, but he comes back to Washington to oversee the impeachment of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. So there he is in Washington doing his role as vice president following his killing of Alexander Hamilton in this duel. I just found that fascinating. I mean, just absolutely fascinating.
And here's the final fascinating part to this whole duel and to the crazy life between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. So as you mentioned, he goes on the run. There's this, we've talked about it in the previous podcast, that people think that, he was trying to start a new country and all of these things were happening. So he leaves the country again. And so in 1833, 77 years of age, Alexander Hamilton's been dead for about 29 years now. And Aaron Burr comes back needing financial assistance, needing help, and he, quote, falls in love with a very wealthy widow. And we talked about her last week in the podcast, Eliza Jumel. And he wanted her money. I think he went through her money like in 4 months or something like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was very, very fast. He wanted her money, but he didn't really want her. And Eliza soon realizes that, hey, you're not in it for me, you're in it for my money, and I don't want anything to do with you. And so she filed for divorce. She gets rid of Aaron Burr, and it is interesting that these divorce proceedings are going to last for 2 years, and finally, on September 14th, 1836, the divorce is finalized, and Aaron Burr just so happens to die on the same day that his divorce proceedings take place. But what's fascinating by that, Eliza Jumel's lawyer, the lawyer for her, was Alexander Hamilton Jr., Alexander Hamilton's son. Isn't it interesting?
It's a small
Hamilton
world.
versus Burr, round number 2.
Yeah.
Hamilton wins. Burr dies.
Yeah. It's an interesting period in American history and an interesting unfolding of events between two very headstrong people. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever accused Hamilton or Burr of being humble.
Yeah, and just think about all the things that we've talked about now. This is why history you didn't know but should. How fascinating is this that 29 years later,
You got Hamilton
the son
again. Yep.
gets revenge, if you will, for the guy that killed his father, which is exactly what Hamilton was trying to do for his son Philip.
You wonder, we talked last week about Burr's post vice presidency life and how he tried to start an empire, and we talked earlier in the first season about the death of his daughter Theodosia. You wonder if any of that would have happened, the trying to start his own empire and all this, if this duel hadn't happened, or if this duel had turned out differently, if both men had walked off that dueling ground happy and healthy. How things would have been different for Aaron Burr.
Yeah, and the one thing I think both of them did not realize is that the world was big enough for both of them.
Oh, yeah.
But they thought it wasn't.
Yeah.
And it killed them.
And it's such a tragic thing.
It is. It's a tragic story, but it's a story that has been revamped, if you will, through Broadway. But once again, to our listeners, this is why it is so important to do the research and to do the studies, because you see different sides of both characters in the story. And so, I don't know, maybe they'll take our podcast, Ray, and turn it into a Broadway play on Burr. Who knows?
There you go.
Yeah.
Aaron Burr, the musical.
There you go.
With Ray and Chris as historical advisors. Nothing can go wrong there, Chris.
That's right. That's right. But I love talking about it. I think you did an excellent job this week, Ray.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the stories. And I can't wait for us to share with our listeners some of the other things that we have upcoming.
Yep.
We love doing these things, and we hope that you enjoy listening to them as much as we love producing them. And please stay in touch with us. Get in contact with us. Let us know what you like or what you don't like, or maybe there's an episode you want us to talk about. And we're extremely thankful for you and hope that you'll find us on the many different versions that are out there, and Google Play and Podcast, Apple, Sounder, Stitcher, Spotify. You can reach us by email, Facebook. Stop in and say hi. Let us know that you're enjoying the podcast.
Yes, let us know you're out there, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
See you later.